Right, I hope, yes, the mic's on. It works well. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Great to see a full house here. My name's John Porter. I'm going to act as the presenter or the Michael Parkinson for your next hour. I've had to home up on With Respect. It's with great pleasure that I'm introducing an old friend of mine, Steve Venables, who, in my mind, and I'm sure most of yours, is one of the most adventurous, inspiring mountaineers of our generation. But he's a very multi-talented person, as you will discover. He was a pianist. I did ask, actually, if we could get the piano out, but there wouldn't have been room, so I think ticket sales are probably more important. He's a cabinet maker, brilliant photographer. I met Stephen way back in 1985 when he swept the boards here at the photographic competition, one of the early Kendall festivals. Great writer of 8 books. He's won both the Grand Prize at Banff and the Boardman Tasker, and they will be on sale later on. And also, as you're about to learn, he's a great entertainer. So before I hand over to Stephen to talk firstly a bit about the Kangshung Face, hope everybody's turned their phone off. If not, take a moment to fumble around and do so. And it's also with pleasure that I thank Cotswold, who provided us with these wonderful note cards, who have done a wonderful job in bringing the book festival to you. And of course, all the staff of the Kendall Festival who are here to help us out. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to do a slideshow on the Kangshung Face to start with. Just to remind you, Reinhold Messner described this as the most adventurous climb in Everest history. And it probably remains that way. Stephen.
Thank you, John. Well, I better make this entertaining and brief. This is just a very little sort of brief introduction to what we did on Everest 35 years ago. But I quite like this sort of arithmetical symmetry because this team, are they there on the screen? Yeah, this team first climbed the mountain 70 years ago, and we climbed it 35 years ago, and so there's a nice sort of mirror arithmetical image there. But by all accounts, this was a very happy expedition that made the first ascent back in 1953. And I think it was Eric Shipton who said famously afterwards, well, now Everest has been climbed, we can all get on with real climbing. Little did he know. And of course, other people wanted to go to the mountain. The Americans came in 1963. They got to the summit, and the summit team included Tenzing Norgay's cousin, Nawang Gombu, seen here blessing President Kennedy at the White House. Gombu was the first person to climb Everest twice. But what was really exciting in '63 was what Tom Hornbeam did with his friend Willie Unsold. And they formed a sort of splinter group and said, hey, we're going to do a new route up Everest. They got up onto the West Ridge, and they made their way across trespassing into Tibet and up what's became known as the Hornbeam Couloir. And what was really impressive was that it was total commitment. Once they got up the Hornbeam Couloir, they couldn't get back down again. They were committed to traversing over the summit and down to the South Col, and ended up bivouacking at about 8,500 meters on the way down to the South Col. Well, another seminal event, that's the West Ridge Direct, which was climbed later by the Yugoslavs, and attempted in winter by John Porter and his friends without oxygen. They didn't have a hope in hell in getting up it. Completely crazy. Other seminal events. Dougal Haston and Doug Scott, pictured here, bivouacking even higher at the south summit of Everest in 1975, having reached the summit at sunset when Dougal Haston took his only ever climbing photograph of Doug Scott standing on the summit. And that, of course, was another of these very, very happy expeditions, masterminded by Chris Bonington, who I'm delighted to say is here with Loretto this morning. Masterminding this amazing logistical feat with a large team climbing the southwest face, the first ascent of the southwest face of Everest. And then the Chinese came and they climbed the original British route up the north side, and it turned out actually they probably climbed it way back in 1960. Well, waiting in the wings was a young Tyrolean called Reinhold Messner, seen here, photographed by Leo Dickinson in 1977 in an aeroplane, unpressurized, at about 29,500 feet above sea level, flying over the summit of Everest without an oxygen mask, going a little bit blue about the gills, but not dying, and saying, well, next year we will do the next step, which is we climb Everest without oxygen. And he invited his old friend Peter Habeler, photographed here more recently on Striding Edge, and they made the first ascent without oxygen, a huge sort of breakthrough in the knowledge of what was possible. Another outstanding climber of our era, well, slightly older than me, this late 20th century Himalayan climber, was John Roskelly, American climber, photographed here in Tierra del Fuego with the Australian climber Tim McCartney-Snape. Now, Tim was the first person to climb Everest from sea level properly. He ran most of the way from the Bay of Bengal. When he got to the river Ganges, he swam 3 miles across the Ganges, keeping his mouth very firmly closed, and continued running all the way. He attempted the West Ridge, decided that was too difficult on his own, and ended up soloing the South Col route to the summit of Everest. He did it without oxygen. I think it was in 1990. But what was really interesting was what he did back in 1984, when he came with a small team of Australian climbers, not well known. They'd done a bit in the Himalayas, and they said, let's go and climb a new route on Everest. And in 1984, they climbed up the Great Couloir, or the Northern Couloir, as it's sometimes known. And Colin Monteith, a wonderful Kiwi photographer, took this stunning shot from down on the Rongbuk Glacier as sunset was approaching. And if you zoom in really close to the top of the north face, you can actually see Andy Henderson, who sadly didn't quite make it to the top, and Greg Mortimer up on the right, and Tim McCartney-Snape about to arrive on the summit of Everest, rather like Scott and Hassan arriving on the summit at sunset before making a quite dodgy retreat back to their top camp where Lincoln Hall was waiting for them. And they were really completing what Edward Norton so nearly pulled off 60 years earlier in 1924, photographed here by Somerville, heading to the Great Couloir and that elusive final summit pyramid. Well, this picture was taken by the man in the silly hat, George Mallory, in 1921, and he was one of the members of the first expedition ever first Western expedition ever to come to Everest, the Everest Reconnaissance. I think of all the Everest expeditions, that would have been the most amazing one to be on. They had a look at the great east face of Everest, the Kangshung Face. Mallory took this stunning early morning photograph with the ice cliffs just catching the morning light. And he came up with this great quote, "Other men less wise might attempt this way if they would, but emphatically it was not for us." And I talk about throwing down the gauntlet, but it was many years, many decades before the gauntlet was picked up by an American expedition which finally climbed this face in 1983. Actually one of the great unsung achievements on Everest. It was an amazing achievement. And then we came 5 years later, to see if we could climb a new route up the east face, and our idea was to climb a new route up the left-hand buttress leading to the South Col and maybe the summit. Well, this expedition was all thanks to a man called Robert Anderson, who photographed here at Tremaddock in Wales. And Robert applied to the Chinese government for a permit, and they said, north face is booked up for years to come, but you can have the east face if you like. No one wants to go to the east face. So he said, okay, we'll try the east face. So that's why we went there. Part of his sort of marketing campaign was to get some historical involvement. So he became the official 35th anniversary ascent. And he came to London to meet John Hunt, who had led the first ascent back in 1953. And John, bless him, who I'd met in a pub in Wiltshire a few years previously, said, well, there's this young English chap called Stephen Venables, and it'd be really nice if you could take a British climber on your team because you're commemorating a British expedition. So thank you, John. I got the chance to go on this wonderful expedition. And here we all are, actually a year later, at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, at the Explorers Club annual dinner with our honorary leader and Wendy Davis, who was the sort of PR and sponsorship person who put this package together. And here we are, actually. Oh, I don't know how that happened. There's been a real glitch here. Terribly sorry. I don't know how this happened. The thing's playing up. Extremely annoying. Go back to where we should be. It's really annoying when you have something perfectly prepared and then it plays tricks on you. Here we are, yeah, in Tibet, March the 3rd, 1988. As I said, got parachuted basically into this essentially American team led by Robert Anderson. And what a great bunch they were, and what a delight it was to join them. Ed Webster was undoubtedly the climbing star of the team, known for, well, actually, like John, he started his climbing in New England before moving to Colorado and making many famous first ascents in the western Colorado and Utah. Well, the Kangshung Face is quite a long way from anywhere. It's an approach walk of about 30 miles, crossing an 18,000-foot pass. And we were in March, and we had a lot of bad weather, and basically it took 23 days to travel 30 miles to get to base camp. It was an irksome journey, but finally we got there. Unlike the godforsaken place where they all go on the Khumbu side, which I've seen pictures of, we actually had a rather nice base camp, lovely spot. Advanced base camp 5 miles up the glacier was a bit more austere, but my God, what a place. It was spectacular. We were at the foot, at a respectful distance, from this 3,500 meter high wall. It's just this amazing, great precipice with Lhotse, the world's fourth highest mountain, on the left. And it's a great place for avalanche watching. These things just came down all the time. And another one. Ah, there's one on peak 38. Boom, and another one off Lhotse. It was like sort of Soleil Lumiere show. It's just incredible. Well, here we are from our advanced base camp, as I said, at a respectful distance from the wall. That's the big buttress on the right, which the Americans climbed in 1983. And then our proposed route to the South Col, which was really, it was all Ed Webster's idea. He'd looked at the photos and said, well, yeah, maybe we can find a route up there. So this is what we came to try. I introduced the Americans to the alpine start. They weren't sort of quite used to this notion of getting up in the dark. It's hell, but it's always worth it, because there's that marvelous moment when the sun rises and there you are up on this great wall, and it was stunning. It was just the most beautiful place to be. Well, this is just to give you an impression. The climbing initially was very steep, and I remember that first day. It was April the 3rd. I was climbing with Robert, and I got to lead the first sort of quite hard pitch. What a thrill just to be up here on Everest. First time I'd ever set foot on the mountain, climbing this quite hard rock climbing and mixed climbing. Just an utter joy. And it was like being on one of the big alpine north faces, but perhaps a bit harder and a bit steeper, and with, it has to be admitted, quite a lot of stuff hanging over our heads. Quite spectacular ice climbing, some seriously vertical ice climbing. But just stupendous situations. This was sunrise on what we call the Cauliflower Ridge. A lot of people said mistakenly that we made an alpine-style ascent. We did nothing of the sort. We actually did an old-fashioned siege, rather as Chris's team did on the Southwest Face back in 1975. I think to climb this thing straight off, bottom to top, for us would have been impossible. So we fixed all the hardest bit of the route, the lower part of the route. And we spent a long time doing that, and we put a lot of work into it. So we worked away, we nibbled away at it day by day. And like any expedition, there was downtime at base camp and advanced base camp. I think I was away for 4 months. Took us about a month to get to base camp. We had about 7 weeks at base camp and above. And during those 7 weeks, I think we had about 25 days actual climbing. And then there were days sitting around, at times getting a bit bored, times getting a bit frustrated, trying to keep one's spirits up. But above all, there was a great team spirit. They were a fantastic group. We even got into sculpture. Yeah, I do sculpture as well as cabinet making. There you are. Anyway, great team. Robert, Paul, Ed, and myself. This was actually setting off one of our false attempts. This was going to be a summit attempt. We actually came back about 3 hours later when it started snowing. But basically, we worked away at the route. We fixed ropes up the hardest part of the route. That took 2 or 3 weeks. And then a month after arriving, we did a push on May Day up to about 7,500 meters, much easier ground, and we left a cache for our second camp. And then a week later, on May the 8th, we set off on our final push. And on May the 9th, having set off in perfect weather, we were wading. This wasn't hard climbing. This is what Robert called hard altitude wallowing, and we did a lot of wallowing. 14 hours that day, but the sun came out the next day, and we continued. And on the third day, for Paul and Ed and I, this was exciting because none of us had ever been this high before. And we finally got out to the South Col at just under 8,000 meters, which is a godforsaken place. Some of you have been there, and I'm sure you will concur with that. Well, it's one of those few occasions in my life when I thought, well, if we don't get these tents up, basically we're going to die. It was quite critical. There was a freezing cold wind. We were at 8,000 meters, no one there to help us, just these two little tents. And there were times having to take my mittens off to do fiddly things where I thought, you've got to be so careful not to get frostbite. But we got things organized. We waited a day to go to the summit because it was very windy. And during that day, Paul Tier felt ill, so he decided he would go back down to Advanced Space Camp. So it was only 3 of us who set off up the sort of broad gully that leads up towards the Southeast Ridge. Well, just one photo of our summit day taken by Ed Webster of our leader. It just sums it all up. Life at approaching 9,000 meters. Human beings weren't designed to go there. And I know our contemporary Ang Rita, I think he climbed Everest 12 or 13 times without oxygen. But, you know, quite frankly, we weren't in that league. We were absolutely stretched to the limit. Alas, Robert and Ed only made it as far as the South Summit, about 250 feet below the actual summit. And they had to turn back. They were there so late in the day. This picture was taken by either Charles Evans or Tom Bourdillon in 1953. And I'd sort of grown up with this picture, so I knew this final ridge. These were the first human beings ever to see it close up back in 1953. And one can imagine the agony, particularly of Tom Bourdillon, when Charles Evans said to him, look, the oxygen's about to run out, it's not working. If you want to see Jennifer again, you've got to turn around, which they did. And of course, Hilary and Tenzing completed the climb 3 days later, famously climbing that last little obstacle, which Mike Ward had identified several years earlier from an aerial photograph that might be a final little obstacle before the summit, which has become known as the Hillary Step. Well, 35 years on, I took this picture approaching the Hillary Step, wondering whether Ed and Robert might be coming soon, but still no sign of them behind me. To give an impression of my summit experience, this was taken 3 years later, and it shows Ed Viesturs, American climber, on his first gasless ascent in 1991. But it just sums up the atmosphere beautifully of how it feels to be taking those final few steps to the top of the world. In my case, I got there and there were 3 empty oxygen cylinders sitting on the summit. My only summit offering were 2 little envelopes containing some dried flower petals from an ashram in Pondicherry, which had been given me by the sons, Nawang and Sonam, of a great friend of John's and I's and Chris's, called Harish Kapadia and his wife Geeta. So I had this little sort of talisman which I left on the summit. It was very late in the day. I ended up bivouacking, rather like Doug Scott and Dougal Haston, slightly lower than them, slightly higher than Tom Hornbein. I think it was a record for a solo bivouac in terms of altitude at that time. Robert and Ed sheltered the night in an abandoned Japanese tent slightly lower down. We all reconvened in the morning, and here we are returning to the South Col. When Doug Scott came back from his famous bivouac in 1975, I remember seeing on the telly, on the film, saying, oh, the quality of survival was good. I have to say, in our case, the quality of survival was probably not so good. But we did survive. The less said about the descent in this brief introduction, the better. Suffice it to say, it took us another 3 days to get back down. We did look a fair old mess when we eventually returned to advance the base camp. But as ever, as Reinhold Messner once said, the sweetest moment on an expedition, on a big Himalayan climb, is that moment when you return to Earth. And the returning to Earth was very sweet indeed. Well, there we are, final farewell. And I never mentioned, and I should mention, because they were such an integral part of our Everest family. Joe Blackburn in the red jacket, who was our official photographer. Pasang Norbu from Solo Khumbu, who went on his first Everest expedition in 62, I think, with the great Ang Take, Pasang Norbu, who was the expedition cook in the white cap, and the most glamorous doctor ever to work on an Everest expedition, the gorgeous Mimi Zeeman, with her arms around me, and Paul Tier. Anyway, there we are at the end of our expedition. And I've just got a commercial, because I don't want to forget this at the end. Ed Webster, who, as I said, was the star of our climbing team and who took many of the best photographs, died very suddenly a year ago on Tuesday. Just dropped dead. I think a heart attack, aged just 66. And it was a terrible blow to all of us and to his family. And as you know, in America, there's not really much of a welfare state. Ed was not a rich man, and he was not planning to die at 66. And his friend, another contemporary of John's from New England, Henry Barber, has set up a fund. And that fund's really to try and look after Ed's amazing archive of books and photographs and letters and documents, because he was a great historian. And also to have some provision towards his daughter Joelle's college education, which she'd just started. She's just in her first term when Ed suddenly died. To try and make a little contribution towards it, I've got a couple of copies of Ed's wonderful book, the most lavishly illustrated book ever produced on Everest, Snow in the Kingdom. I noticed A Books is selling them for $1,100. I thought that was a bit steep, but I've got one for £120. It's signed by the entire team. It's part of a limited edition. It's also signed by Brad Washburn. And I've also got a couple of Ed's Everest Sunrise posters, which are signed by all the team. Anyway, if anyone's interested, I've got them there. Afterwards, it'd be lovely not to have to take them home. And I've got some of my own books, which go for rather more modest prices, and they're in aid of the Venables grocery bills. Right. Okay.
Wow. Well, you lived up to your reputation as an entertainer. That was fantastic, Stephen. Where to begin? I think we have to go back a bit before we actually talk about Everest. Although I will say, I'm sure many of you have read Higher Than the Eagle Soars. And the writing of that last few days and the descent, I think is some of the finest mountaineering literature and writing of all time. So if you haven't read it, get it, because you just got a very sort of cursory view. The way they suffered and persevered, touched the void and came back is quite remarkable. It's brilliant writing. But I'm going to, you mentioned Mallory had thrown down the gauntlet, and that famous quote as he looks at the face. Of course, there's a history there, isn't there? Because you went to Charterhouse, which not only was Mallory teaching there, but Wilfred Noyce, I believe, was a master there.
Yeah. There were sort of climbing connections, and you know, there's nothing so crass as I then dreamed I'd go and climb Everest, but it was sort of lurking in the subconscious. And I mentioned in a talk the other day, I used to spend a lot of time in the music school. I was quite nerdy, I still am probably. And anyway, on the way to practice my scales and arpeggios every day, I'd go past this two memorial plaques. One was to Wilfred Noyce, who had been on the 53 Everest expedition, and one was George Mallory, who'd been on the first 3 Everest expeditions. And it was rather poignant. And so it was sort of lodged in my subconscious, you know, Everest and the whole climbing story, yeah.
Did you start climbing at Charterhouse?
No, I didn't. I wanted to climb. I was interested in it, but I didn't really start climbing. I'd done a tiny bit. I didn't really start climbing until I left school, and I was about to leave school. I grew up in Surrey near Gatwick Airport. You know, you don't meet many climbers there. Certainly didn't then. And I heard there was a boy in the village. He was only 15. I was 17, and I phoned him up and said, "Can we go climbing?" And we went to Harrison's Rocks, and where I did some of my first climbing, like Chris Bonington, like Martin Boyson, like Mick Fowler, like lots of people. They took it a bit further than me, but that's where I started.
Yeah, right. And then you went to Oxford,
yeah.
Again with a tremendous tradition of climbing, and you felt a bit kind of out of place at first, I think.
Well, I don't think I realised quite how good all these people were and how clever. And they weren't as good as the people at Leeds. John was at Leeds University. They were like the sort of E team, the Leeds University Mountaineering Club. We, the OUMC, I think we were the sort of B team. And there's another one here, Ian Jackson, sitting in the front here. We were climbing in Borrowdale 50 years ago. So I think but there was some very good climbers, and it took me a while, I think, to sort of, I mean, clubs can be quite sort of cliquey things.
You have to prove yourself.
It took me quite a while to sort of make inroads here.
Yeah. I think the only reason Leeds may have been above Oxford was because we had Armscliffe and lots of gritstone to throw ourselves
on your
at.
doorstep. Yeah.
Whereas you had, of course, those wonderful towers in Oxford.
Yes,
I think there's a guidebook, isn't there? And I think you got yourself in trouble once with the current president of the Alpine Club.
Yeah, actually, it wasn't until I went back to a dinner. I was then a respectable school teacher in my sort of late 20s, and we made an attempt on Tom Tower on Christchurch with Simon Richardson, who was a very distinguished international mountaineer. And he was still an undergraduate, and he had to get his degree. If he didn't get his degree, he wouldn't get his lucrative job at Shell. And when the police arrived, Simon said, "We've got to get out of here, because if I get sent down, that's it. No degree, no job in Shell." So it was a failed attempt.
Yeah, one of the few. Throughout your writings, Stephen, there's a lot of wonderful insights. And just mentioning, and I find this very hard to believe, when you were at Charterhouse, you said, I was personally inept, but I could work hard. I think that's a theme that extends right through your life. Not only did you work hard, but you're incredibly adventurous. I mean, the world has changed a lot. We used to hitchhike, and you once took an amazing hitchhike journey. We were still a teenager, I believe, right through the Balkans, up to the Alps to go climbing.
Yeah, I didn't see that amazing at the time. It's what you did. I mean, I'd been in Israel, and I'd been hitchhiking around Israel, and on the way home I got a flight to Athens and hitched through Greece and Turkey and up through the Balkans and eventually to the Alps. The problem was I wanted to go climbing in the Alps, and I'd arranged to go climbing, but I was going with a French friend who was not prepared to go unless we took a guide, and that was going to cost at least £15. So I had to save £15. So basically, I hitchhiked all the way through the Balkans and the rest of it for 3 weeks, virtually not eating because I couldn't afford to spend any money. So that was quite adventurous, I suppose.
I think it's very adventurous, and of course, the great thing is you meet people that way that you never would meet.
Yeah.
We lived in a much more capsuled world nowadays, don't we, with social media? That's a personal view, but there's a lot of freeness, and we were so lucky. We were both in Afghanistan in 1977, and it really was something straight out of 1001 Nights. We were privileged, weren't we, in ways which it's much harder to find those blanks on the map these days.
I think, well, yeah, because it was harder to get there. I mean, you went by train all the way across Russia. We went by bus. It took a month to get there. And yeah, it was a big adventure, yes. And there was certainly you couldn't sort of sign up to a package to get there.
No, you went on the Magic Bus, didn't you?
No, I actually went on Budget Bus. Magic
Bus.
Magic Bus was £70. I think Budget Bus was £80. It was sort of one up from Magic Bus.
Ah.
Yeah, it was a bit deluxe.
A bit less pushing up hills, maybe. Just a theme, we were talking the other day about this. A lot of your climbing companions were scientists, as were mine, Rouse and David Lund, Wilkie, and you took a bit of ribbing about that. But in my view is that it requires both a scientific approach to the mountain and knowing it, but the actual activity itself is probably closer to art than it is to sport. At no time in your writing have I heard you or read that you describe climbing as sport. What do you think? I mean, is there something in the creative spirit of climbers that's creating a path which is akin to art?
Well, one has to be so careful not to stray into the realm of pretentiousness. So just tread carefully. But well, firstly, I am the most unsporty person in the world, and I think that's true of quite a lot of climbers. I'm a total disaster on the games pitch. I have no, hand-eye coordination. I can't hit a ball to save my life. So climbing was a way to do something physical, intensely physical, and to do moderately well as a source of great happiness. So Yeah, I'm not sporty, and I'm definitely not a scientist. You know, I just scraped through a basic science O-level, and I only had 2 years scientific education in my entire life. So I'm woeful. I'm classic product of our sort of British, you know, liberal arts education. Not fit for very much, but so yeah. And in terms of climbing, I do think climbing is an art at its best. And I do think, you know, I mean, I think rock climbing, you know, classic rock climbing, looking at a cliff and seeing a line and following a line, and the artistry of using the features of what the rock has to offer. Not you know, turning up and just drawing a lot of parallel lines up some overhang in Crete or somewhere and then drilling holes all about it. I'm talking about, you know, real climbing. And I do think that there is an artistry to it, yeah. Or you know, following a line up a big mountain. And it's actually the first book I wrote. I couldn't think what the hell, you know, writing a book's easy. It's trying to think of a title for the damn thing. And in the end, I came up with this title, Painted Mountains, partly because one of the mountains we had been referred to as the Painted Mountain, but also this idea of mountains painted by the different light and color and painting and drawing a line up the mountain and so on. So yeah, I think there is an element of that.
Thank you. That kind of proved my point, I think. Of course, Painted Mountains was your first Boardman Tasker winner as well.
Yeah.
And Stephen will be here later on tonight for those of you who are going to the BT. There's another element of your climbing which I found absolutely terrifying, and that is your enjoyment of some pretty hairy soloing. And I didn't realize that, for example, when you sailed to the sky many years ago, you got to the top of the Cullen Ridge and said, oh, it's 1 a.m, I haven't done this ridge, and off you set at a trot to complete the ridge in 7 hours. Yeah. This is before anybody was even thinking about records. But I mean, that was a small example. You then tried the north face of the Matterhorn on your own in winter. You wandered around the Turin Glacier. After you'd climbed the Eiger, you had this great idea, talk about not a chance, of going and soloing the Eiger Direct. Where does all that come from? I mean, it is certainly, I know it can release you, but it's also extremely dangerous.
Well, I think soloing can be intensely satisfying if you're in the right mood and you're enjoying it and you're feeling in control. And you know, I remember I've had a wonderful day in the Avon Gorge, near where I used to live, soloing Malbogie is a very famous climb done by Chris Bonington, and Suspension Bridge of Rhett and various other things, and feeling totally in control and loving it. But you've got to be in the right mood. The time when I had this ludicrous idea of soloing the John Harlan route on the Eiger Direct was probably not very realistic. And the previous day I soloed a route called the Kingspitze, north face of the Kingspitze and the Egelhorner, which is in a totally different league. And then I set off and bivouacked below up at Alpiglen, just below the north face, with a monstrous rucksack full of gear and food for a week, and managed not to wake up the next morning, and then eventually woke up long after dawn and thought, oh, there's a bit of cloud, oh good, I've got an excuse, I can go home. And it was quite obviously, you know, I didn't want to do it, and I was terrified, and I wanted to be alive, and so I went home.
There's the call of home. And of course, our generation experienced a lot of fatalities. A lot of our very good friends died. And there's very, very revealing, and actually throughout a lot of your writings, Stephen, you have these little insights, not only for your own climbing and career, but everybody else and the way climbers feel about it. And this was something you wrote after a friend of yours, John Weatherseed, had died, and you'd met his father. And you write, we had all conspired in this perverse game that had destroyed his son, all of us, reinforcing each other and others' dreams. Do you think a lot of mountaineers of our generation feel that way, or do we just sweep it under the carpet?
Well, I suppose there's always been a vein of sort of black humor that is a sort of part of our sort of survival instinct. But yeah, I do think, well, I mean, I think male climbers have a tendency to shy away from getting close to anything too uncomfortably personal and profound. And we tend to sort of shy away from these things because, we can't deny that we're doing something quite dangerous, and people do sometimes die. And in the case of John Weatherseed, and in fact 2 others, including someone called Paul Beanie, and Dave Luscombe, with whom I climbed in my first alpine season, when they died, it was my first experience really of death, and it was a huge shock. But yeah, it was John's father turning up and seeing him there in Snell's Field in the campsite, coming to collect his son's belongings, really brought it home. And I did feel, here we were all having fun, and we reinforce each other in this pursuit. So I did feel a slight sense of collective guilt. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a community that shares grief together. But I think what also sums up why climbers do what they do in the high mountains is another quote from Stephen. It was also beautifully simple. Make the moves correctly or die. I mean, you wrote about that when you were making some horrendous descent, having gone the wrong way on somewhere in the Dolomites. But I think that sums it up, doesn't it? It's kind of because that simplicity, it's kind of a long ways away from the complexities of the day-to-day life, having to sit here and stress a bit about it or earn a living. But there's another point in Where Eagles Soar, where you say, for once in my life, I was totally determined to actually not run away from something, but to complete it. And that was your writing, and something you've obviously returned to so many times. Have you got future plans now to write?
Nothing concrete, John. I've been rather idle on the writing front. As you know, as we all know, writing is bloody hard work. And I've done 11 books altogether, but I haven't done one that recently. And sometimes I sort of feel I've run out of anything to say.
Well, yeah.
but actually, interesting what you said about the first one, because everyone wants to write a book. It's something we all want to do. And I was actually staying with our friend Muslim Contractor, who I think you know, in Bombay, in Mumbai, and at the end of an expedition, and I had some spare time, and I thought, I really must, for once in my life, do it, and I actually sat down and started working on a synopsis and a sample chapter, and I got home and I got someone to type it up on an electric typewriter and sent it off to Maggie Boddy at Hodder & Stoughton, editor of Peter Boardman, Eric Shipton, Chris Bollington, everyone, and then this wonderful phone call, and they said, I think you need to come in and meet us. And so that was actually far more exciting than getting up the north face of the Eiger or whatever. Very thrilling.
Well, it is thrilling, and I mean, your writing is just fantastic. For those of you who know it, I'll just give you another insight as to why we do it. This is a quote from a winter attempt, or a winter ascent, I should say, with our good friend Lindsay Griffin on the Chardonnay.
Oh, yeah.
And you're having a miserable time of it, because it is bloody cold in the Alps in those days before global warming in the winter.
It was tough.
And you say that you were there struggling up this ice funnel. You're saying, and it was over the waves of spindrift. I gasped miserably, hating this white hell, vowing never to return. Until the clouds suddenly parted. The sun came out, and the snow-laden, I'm going to have to put my glasses on.
Something about sparkling.
That's it. The sun came out, and the snow-laden air sparkled with the kind of visionary beauty which induces instant amnesia. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? Poetic, lyrical, and kind of sums it up. You go, oh, well, it's not that bad. Yeah. Except at about 2 in the morning when you think, well, actually, maybe it was pretty cold. Just a few more things before we hand over to the audience for questions. You've had some incredible moments of perseverance throughout your life, Everest being obviously the high point, but at Kangshung Face you went back a number of times in hopes of what we all, I guess, would call the lucky break.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that. What happened?
Well, Kangshung Face is I think it's the 22nd highest mountain in the world, for what that's worth. It's a big, almost 8,000 meter peak in the Karakoram, above the Hispar Glacier, for anyone who knows that part of the world. Stunning peak. And a friend called Phil Bartlett and I went there with Dave Wilkinson, a mutual friend, just the three of us. This was back in 1980. And we got quite close, and we climbed alpine style. We actually climbed most of it unroped, which I think at times was probably very foolish. And we pushed through three times to about 7,000 meters. But we never got, and each time we got hit by a big storm and dumped meters of snow, and we had a perilous retreat. But although we didn't get up it was the most all-consuming adventure. It was one of the great experiences of my life, and I think we all felt that. And being foolish, we thought, well, if we come back next year, we'll be more lucky. So we went back the next year, signed away another whole summer. On that occasion, we were joined by a very fine American climber called Carlos Bueller, and by an outstanding British climber called Dick Renshaw, which was when I first met Dick. And so we had sort of royalty joining the team. And we didn't even get anywhere near our high points of the previous year's attempt. So the thing was a total washout. But it was a good formative experience. And you just think, well, if I keep plugging away at this, eventually I'll get lucky.
Yeah, it does happen occasionally, doesn't it? As we discovered on Everest. Let's just reflect again on Everest, because literally the world's highest mountain, and I think you would say the pinnacle, the height of your climbing ambitions. They seem to be the culmination of pretty much everything else we've discussed. And when that offer came, and well, you've shown beautifully, and you were there at the Explorers Club in New York, one thought was in your mind, I believe, and that was, of course it would be wonderful to climb Everest, but what really mattered was how you climbed Everest. So you just happened to fall in with the right mob, didn't you, for that one?
Yes, yeah. Actually, it's quite curious. That year, at the end of 1987, by chance, I got a letter from Mal Duff, a name might mean something to some of you, and he was planning to go and attempt the West Ridge, finding swag left by the British Services expedition in the autumn. That never happened, needless to say. There was also a possibility of joining someone called Al Evans to help him filming the big British Services expedition on the West Ridge, to help making a film, which would have been interesting. And then this chance came to go to the East Face with this tiny American team to attempt a new route up the East Face. And immediately it became obvious, you know, that is the opportunity to grab. That's the big one. That's the one that would be really worth doing. So it was just this lucky thing that landed in my lap.
And you were the kind of quintessential Englishman with these kind of rough and hey man, how's it going? How they hanging? Sort of group.
Yeah. Actually, sorry.
But I was going to say, I mean, do you think that the fact that you were there and so different, did that make a difference to their own motivation?
I sure at times I was incredibly precious and tiresome and difficult and quite impatient. In Ed's account of the climb called Snow in the Kingdom, there are a lot of references to Venables losing his temper, which I don't know where I was so bad-tempered, but anyway, a certain impulsiveness. But yeah, we came from different backgrounds, I suppose. There's a lovely quote by Ed Douglas, and he's referring to a photo of the four of us plus Mimi and Joe sitting around in the snow in our little, our sort of plastic camping chairs. And he looks at this photo and he says, it's a classic photo. The Americans lounge back with studied cool, while our man in Tibet sits knees together to attention, trying to think of something enthusiastic to say. So summed it up quite nicely.
Absolutely. There's another interesting quote you made, which, I mean, the world has changed very much. We've already talked about that. We can't go to Kabul anymore to the donut shop on Chicken Street, where one of the places we first met. But Everest has become something, it's always been there as the world's highest mountain, well, since it was discovered 1850, whenever it was. But you write, the importance of this place is entirely a human construct. And I think that's worth reflecting on a bit. It is, and it's become more than that now. It's become part of a big numbers game.
Yeah.
Whether we should be even thinking, it's just the world changes. Everything seems to me. My friend Wojtek Kurtyka describes us being living in the tyranny of numbers, where you have to have a number attached to something to make it work. And I think the great thing about you'll find when you read any of Stephen's books is that that was the last thing in his mind. It was just all about the adventure and the right people. And finally, Stephen, so you write also towards the end of where the eagle soars, or higher than the eagle soars, that Everest freed you to do other things.
Yeah, I think it's. I think I once used the phrase escaping from the tyranny of ambition. I mean, it's quite nice to have done something, such an all-consuming experience where we, to be quite frankly, we quite nearly died. As Reinhold Messner said, you have done a very hard thing, but you were very lucky. And so having been through something like that, it's quite nice to think, well, even if I never do another hard climb again, I mean, I hope I will, but even if I don't, I've got that memory to enjoy. And then, there are other things to do. And now when I do things reasonably adventurous, I tend to go to the Southern Ocean, to South Georgia and Antarctica, where we can do exciting things, and you don't have to go, the very highest you might have to go would be 3,000 meters above sea level, so there's no altitude to worry about. So, yeah, in that sense, you're freed up to go on other adventures, yeah.
To have another life.
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Well, we've got a 10, 12 minutes or so for questions from the audience. I don't know if we want to put the lights up, but if you have any questions, go ahead. I'll try to spot people. Questions for Stephen?
Is there a couple over there, John?
All right. Gentleman with the glasses in the front.
Yeah. Hi, Stephen. I went to a talk of yours many years ago in Wales, and you talked about that time, I think it was on the top of Everest, where you felt that the spirits of people that had gone kind of helped you get through a really bad night. I wonder if that's happened again.
Oh, the ghosts of past climbers at altitude, yeah. Yes, I mean, I think I described it in the book on this fairly epic descent and ending up bivouacking. I suddenly had this, I had this weird sensation, and lots of people experienced it, not just at altitude, of someone else being there, of being accompanied by another person, in my case it felt like sort of older man, older possibly and wiser. But then during the night I had this weird sensation where I was lying there shivering, and Eric Shipton was there trying to warm up my toes. and then later Mike Scott, who I've never met, who's the son of Doug Scott, was there trying to warm my toes up. They didn't do a very good job, I have to say. But yeah, it was a very intense experience, and I think probably everyone's experienced similar things where you're a combination of no sleep, no food, very little drink. You're running on reserves, and I think you're very susceptible to these experiences.
Did you feel that it sort of got you through the fact that
Yeah,
was happening?
possibly. I don't know really, but possibly that there's all kinds of stuff we don't really understand swirling around in our subconscious, and maybe there's something there that helped get me through. Yeah. There's someone.
Somebody else that?
So now we're kind of all of a certain age, and you're sitting in your armchairs and talking about your adventures.
Cute.
I do a lot of reading, and I was recently reading some Boardman stuff, and I was imagining sort of bivouacking, sort of at temperatures of -10, and I just wondered in your own mind whether you've actually considered whether you could do that at your age, not without the physical aspect of getting to the bivouac, but whether you could actually make it through the night, do you think, even with modern equipment?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, when you bivouac at 8,650 meters, it's probably about -30, and you know, I didn't have a sleeping bag or anything, or a karamat. So, and I was 34, and you're quite strong when you're 34. I certainly don't intend to try it now. But you know, I survived partly because I was lucky because there was no wind that night. But then I read Bernadette's book about the Polish climbers and Jerzy Kokuszka. He routinely just sat down in the snow at 8,000 meters in winter, night after night, just as a matter of course. And occasionally he'd get a bit of frostbite, and he'd just carry on regardless. I mean,
These are young men.
he was also in his 30s, yeah. So if he was still alive, whether he'd still be doing it now at 70 or whatever he'd be.
Would you have the strength of character to be able to see it?
Strength of character. Well, I have no intention of putting myself in that position, so I'll never find out. I think, yeah, of course, short, but it's partly a determination. Yeah, I mean, back then, as a youngish man, I had no intention of dying, and you know, I knew that, as I said, Hornbein and Co. They'd bivouacked slightly lower than that. None of them died. Doug and Dougal didn't even get frostbite, and they were even higher. So, you know, I knew these things were possible, so, but not recommended.
There's somebody on the left back there. Hello.
Sorry, you're going to have to talk very loudly. I left my hearing aid at home.
What do you think is the most important part of your training, or was it in the past, or which aspect of training do you think is very important?
Training. What's that? You're talking to the wrong person. No, I've got to take out my subscription to Ratho Climbing Wall, where I live in Edinburgh, because each year I say I must go to Ratho. I must go several times a week, then I'll get strong and climb better. So I've always had a bit of a problem with training, but no, thank you for the question. Now I'll try and be serious for a moment. When we went to Everest, we were all at a good age. I think we were all in our 30s, or Paul was only 28. But I think we'd done a lot of climbing, and I'd been about 10 times to the Himalaya, and so I was used to being uncomfortable, and the previous autumn, I'd been to about 7,700 meters and survived an unintentional bivouac on a very cold night. So I think there was an accumulation of experience, and I'm sure that was extremely helpful. But I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, an athlete, and that was very apparent on summit day, and it took me 16 and a half hours to get from the South Col to the summit. Messner and Habler did it in 10 hours, and that's the difference. And there are Sherpa guys who do it in about probably 5 or 6 hours. So there was an element of mind over matter.
I think there's another aspect. You took a month to get in, so an awful lot of the training and the mental preparation actually takes place in that month. Whereas people going to Everest nowadays, and you actually hear instances of people who they've come straight from an altitude chamber in Strasbourg, been flown into Camp 1, and they're on the summit in 3 days. A completely different mindset. I'm sure that person probably runs loads of marathons before they go into the center. But the walk-in and the bonding and the mental preparation. Remember also, in the 80s, there was no internet, there was no mail runners. So when you left Lhasa or Pindi or wherever, you're on your own. And a lot of the training then becomes the interaction between your teams. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. Good point about the walk-in. We took, nearly a month to travel 30 miles, and we were running up and down to the Langmala, which is 18,000 feet, several times, and doing it a bit faster each time. And not only that, as John said, there's a sort of psychological thing. We were getting to know each other, discovering each other's foibles, perhaps, getting on better, and sort of psyching ourselves up. And as John said, that then you're totally isolated from the outside world. We didn't even have mail runners. We were completely out of contact in this beautiful, beautiful valley, just the 8 of us there. Didn't see any other people for 2 months. So that really becomes your life. And then there's this wonderful, and again, you mentioned simplicity, this wonderful simplicity. For these 2 months, everything else almost ceases to exist, and it's just us here concentrating on this amazing adventure and being totally single-minded about it, which, with no distractions. And I think that's that's a huge advantage. Anyone
More
else?
questions? Well, Mr. Bonington.
Well, I haven't got a question. You've just said absolutely everything. I think you've given all the answers. But what I would just like to say, I think the presentation you've given is one of the best I've ever heard. And I think also, one thing about it is you've spread it out so far. I found I've empathized with and experienced so many of the things that you described. But the thing is that you've actually gone about 3 steps further than I ever have done. And I'm just so impressed.
Oh. Thank you, Chris. I think there was some...
Thank you very much, Chris. Those are very, very kind words.
I'm not sure I can follow that question from Chris. With the exception, Chris, we've obviously heard a lot about your solo exploits, amazing as they are. Was there a particular time when you were a standout moment where you were glad to have a climbing partner with you, and a particular climbing partner that you were with you at that time?
Well, God, yeah, of course. I mean, climbing partners are everything. I'm not a very gregarious person, but I've been lucky to climb with some amazing people and to whom I owe my life. Some of the finest climbs I've done have been with Dick Renshaw, who I mentioned earlier, who was someone I used to read about in magazines when I was a student. He's a bit older than me. He's a man of immense wisdom and experience and tolerance. He's put up with me on numerous occasions. Quite a taciturn person, wasn't a laugh a minute, sort of strong, silent type, but totally trustworthy. And in fact, he and Chris and others responsible basically for saving my life on Panchchuli in 1992. So without them, I'd be at the bottom of a crevasse up there. So there have been many people I've been incredibly lucky to climb with, and as John and I were talking about this beforehand, this thing where you're totally isolated over a long period of time. You do. I mean, I think there's still an element of reserve. It's not like a marriage, but nevertheless, you do become close, and you do form great friendships. So yeah, I have many people to be grateful to. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody...
There's a lady here in a blue top.
Yes, hello.
You mentioned being very musical as well as being excellent in the climbing world. Has music played a big role in your climbing life?
Music in climbing? Well, I hum a lot, and it drives my wife demented. But yeah, I was talking about a friend called John Spencer, who I climb with in Northumberland, and we were talking about earworms and theme tunes on different climbs, and whether you always have a tune in your head. And we both agree we both do. But he was talking to someone else and said, I never do. How strange. But I think it's always there in the back of my... It's just something I enjoy in my life in an amateur way, and it's always there in the back of my mind. And God, this is going to sound so pretentious, but when we did this climb on Everest, just before setting off at 4 in the morning on what we hope is our summit push, Ed Webster, he was never ready in the morning. It's insufferable. He was always faffing about, and I get really impatient. So I thought, well, while Ed's waiting, I'll go back into my tent with all my gear on to keep warm. And I put on we had things called Walkman in those days, and listened to, there's a piece of music called Liszt's B minor piano sonata, which is something I dream of playing and never in 1,000 years will play. And it's a great epic piece. And I listened to the whole of that. And then I said, are you ready now, Ed? And off we went and we climbed Everest. So it was a rather nice sort of prelude to climbing Everest. Yeah.
Right. Well, before we give final thanks to Stephen, I just want to ask the audience a question. Is the police commissioner in the audience today by any chance, or chief constable, or any member of the constabulary? No. Well, Stephen, you have to be very careful when you leave, because Kendal has a one-way system. And one of the times Stephen and I met here at Kendal, he decided he wanted to go straight home, so he turned right out of the brewery, more or less straight into a police car. And surprisingly, he'd had a few beers. So we managed to find enough sober people to go down to the police station. It just happens he was just leaving because the police commissioner had been at his lecture the night before, and he got off. Just remember, turn left when you leave. Everybody, Stephen Venables.
Thank you very much.